All right, well, let's get this thing started. So, my name is Mike Erickson. I go by Mikey at the ski resort, but I've been working at Snowbasin for 20 years now, over 20 years now. And Corey asked me to talk a little bit tonight about accidents and avalanches, which, as a patroller at Snowbasin for over 20 years, you definitely get a good sense and a perspective of the accidents and avalanches that happen out there. So it kind of goes along with the theme that it's been put forth this year with, we've talked about snowpack in his first lecture and terrain management. So obviously this is based around people that are concerned about avalanches and their adventures outside and in the great outdoors. And hopefully I can shed some light on it. And more importantly, I think tonight it's going to be less scientific and, with graphs and charts and numbers, but more of bringing an emotional element to what happens in an actual avalanche accident and the trauma mentally and physically that's involved for everybody. So with that, I am going to share a personal experience later in the discussion that I'm going to do a spoiler alert. You're probably going to see a grown man cry because I'm an emotional person, and it was an emotional experience. So with that, about 20 years ago, back in '99, I asked myself some pretty important questions in life. I was framing houses at the time, didn't really have any direction in life, and I was telling somebody today, a friend of mine, about, my goal in life as a child was to avoid being forced to do anything, like being forced to do work, being forced to go to school, and then all I wanted to do is go outside and play. So when I finally figured it out that there were jobs that let you go outside and play, well, obviously, I decided that's what I needed to do. So I was actually sitting on a beach one time talking to a friend of mine, waiting for the wind to come up because I used to do some windsurfing. And I asked him what he did, and he said, well, he always loved trains, and his grandfather used to take him on train rides. His grandfather was an engineer, and it just clicked in me that, there's this choice in life to do what you want to do and actually make a living with that. So it was 1999, and 2000 was rolling around, and for me it was like, great time. I'm going to actually make a choice to do what I want to do in life. And so that led me to the career of being a ski patroller. I called up the patrol and lied to them that I'd been skiing for a long time. I'd actually been snowboarding for like 7 years. And dusted off my skis in the back room and bought a new pair of boots and showed up my first day, having skied one day in 7 years. And it was kind of a rough go, but it's been a great adventure ever since. So, but with that, going back to avalanches, in my first week of work, I remember being handed an explosive by Paul Wright, if you guys don't know him, and throwing it out on a slope and watching an actual avalanche start. And then within another week or two of that, I was assigned my first avalanche control route. And we used to call them avalanche control routes because we thought we could control avalanches. Now, due to accidents at a few resorts, inbounds and whatever, we've changed that verbiage to actually be avalanche reduction. Because if the resort and the companies that manage skiing wanted to be 100% sure that nobody would get caught in an avalanche within their boundaries, you wouldn't get to ride the lift. Like on a powder day, it wouldn't really open. So, we work really hard and we do everything that we can to help alleviate that risk as much as possible, but we really can't get that down to zero. So we refer to it as avalanche reduction. And on my first avalanche reduction morning, still this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed ski patroller, I rode the Porky Lift, if you guys are familiar with Snowbasin, and I was assigned the swim team route with Cap Nottenkamper and Heather Campbell. It's a long time ago, but anyway, the route that I was given was called the swim team route. And it was actually named that because 4 patrollers in years previous have all been caught at the same time, and they were all swimming. And luckily nobody got completely buried. They were all able to dig themselves out or whatever. But that's how the route got named, is the swim team route. So as I roll up to the top of Porky, I hike up the left-hand turn there, and there's an avalancher up there, and it was foggy. I couldn't see much. And the gunners up there said, like, hold on, don't go anywhere. And they had just shot around up into the Porky Cirque, and they said, we think we see something coming down. And literally, right standing outside the terminal at the top of Porky, remnants of a powder cloud came down and literally the debris went right in front of where we were gonna go. So that's like my first experience of like an avalanche that comes all the way down out of Porky Cirque, runs down the gully, skiers right at the terminal and down through the sign line that the place in the rocks where nobody goes, right? And so we go out there in the fog and we step across the debris that just came down from the hill, and we go up and we run these trams with explosives on them and whatnot. And we'll get to the last one, and this gal named Heather Campbell, who's I think a pretty good mentor for me, just because it was just like, I can't believe that there's this big leader figure that's a female and whatever. But there's this chute right next to this rock. And the way that you deliver this explosive is you kind of like hike up to this tree, you light the explosive, and you throw it as far up ahead of you as you can, up in the hill. And then you hold onto the tree as the avalanche washes down around you. And she did this. And I was completely blown away. But it was awesome, right? So here I am just like experiencing this, just like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. This is crazy. This is wonderful. Everything that I wanted in my life, as far as adventure goes. So that's what started me down this road. Oh man, I'm getting there already, but maybe I'll get it out right now. So anyway, going back to avalanches and accidents, it was a long road of, control mornings and, dealing with accidents and stuff. I'm going to talk about a few of them. But I don't think anybody really has a clear picture of the amount of work that goes into opening the lifts at 9 o'clock in the morning, right? So to give you a glimpse about that is, somebody wakes up at 3:30 in the morning, looks at the weather, sees how much snow has fallen overnight, where the winds are, et cetera, et cetera. They make a phone call at 4 o'clock. And the assembly team, the team of people that start assembling our explosives, gets up, gets to work, and starts assembling explosives. That takes, roughly, an hour and a half. We have a morning meeting that starts at 6:40. So patrollers start showing up at 6:15, getting booted up and ready. We have a meeting at 6:40, and we're riding the lifts at 7 o'clock with 80 some odd explosives that you deliver by hand, another 20 or 30 they get shot out the avalanchers. And all these teams of patrollers go to work, riding the lift at 7, ODARC 30, just to try to have it open by 9. And it's a really tough job to do. It's really fun and all that, but it just takes a lot of effort. So next time, it's a plug for people that are out there waiting in line. And I get it, man. Like if I wasn't a patroller and I had to wait in line for some powder turns, I'd be really frustrated and wanting to get up that hill as fast as I could too. So, but with that, sometimes that leads us to make decisions that are rushed. And there are no, I guess there are plenty of stories of patrollers that have gotten in avalanches and accidents over that time period. And I guess none of it really makes the news for the most part, but Corey and I have friends and all the colleagues we know from other ski resorts, it's a dangerous occupation, but one that people love. So anyway, with that, I wanted to talk specifically about some of our backcountry users and their accidents that we've been involved in for a while, right? So my career started back in 2000. In 2005, I was involved in a rescue operation for a Ogden local that was involved in an accident, and This man, I'd actually known him back when I was framing houses. He had a framing company named Lucky 7 Framing, and they quite often had job sites right next to ours. And we would go to lunch together, we would help each other raise walls, we would do all these things. And he was an avid surfer, and like I said before, I enjoyed windsurfing from time to time. So we chatted about windsurfing and surfing and all that kind of stuff. But him and a friend of his decided to ride the Mount Allen tram back in 2005 and take their last run of the day back towards Ogden. It didn't work out very good for them. He was involved in an avalanche. His partner looked for him and probably did everything he could, but couldn't find him for over an hour or so. And then, back then it wasn't really common to have a phone and have good cell service. So that person then had to travel the rest of the way out Taylor's Canyon and get help. And by that time it was snow and it was nighttime. And a few days later I was involved in the rescue operation with that. A particular part of that I remember was, probing a likely debris pile. And the guy I was with, Mike Proborski, when he pulled his probe up, there was a hair frozen to the end of his probe. And he's like, "Look at that." And I was like, "Well, what are you talking about?" He's like, "There's a hair there." And knowing, I shouldn't say any names, but knowing the victim, I knew that was a match for his hair. He had kind of longer hair. It was curly. It was dark. And so obviously we were in a frenzy of probing around. Maybe this is the spot. It didn't turn out that we were able to find him that night, but he was found the night before. But, after the coroner report and whatever else, it was determined that his cause of death was blunt trauma to the chest causing, a tear in the aorta. So, and he wasn't fully buried. Like he did not die of asphyxiation. So, that's going to play into what I'm going to talk about later tonight. But so that was kind of my first experience. We had another unfortunate experience just outside the boundary at where I work, where a recently divorced dad had, time custody with his two sons, 17 and 12 years old. And they were loving it. It was a great Pounder day. They came up and they were hiking around in the Porky Cirque. Ran into a patroller up there who was like, "Hey, I see you're out enjoying whatever, I see you're hiking around." It's extremely dangerous outside the boundary these days. And they went over to the top of John Paul, went out to Hell's Canyon. And in the process, the boys obviously were better, they were better skiers than their dad, and they kind of took the lead. And the older 17-year-old went kind of charging around. And the dad and the younger son come up on avalanche debris. They find a ski that belonged to their son and brother, and then start looking, obviously, and whatever. A group of snowboarders kind of show up, and we found a helmet down below the toe of the debris that belonged to their son. So they activated the whole system. The patrollers responded with a dog team and some probers, and a while later they were able to locate the victim with a probe strike and a dog. And one of my favorite friends, kind of a legend at Snowbasin, Mike Hansen. I don't know if anybody ever remembers him. He's since moved away. But he was involved in that rescue. And man, if you ever talk to that guy after work or whatever, and these stories came up, it really affected him. And I guess I'm going to probably be a little bit more graphic than people want to know, but I think it's important to the whole story. But in his process of recovering the victim, it got to the point where there was a lot of blood in the snow, and it kind of it reminded him of cherry syrup on a snow cone type of thing. But one of the avalanche dogs kind of reverted back to its nature and became very aggressive, and was part of the things we do to train avalanche dogs involves playing with tugging and whatever. But this patroller in particular, he had some, I guess, serious imagery problems with the dog, tugging and biting at the victim and stuff like that. But those are the things that are involved in these things like avalanches. We tend, I think, to often think of avalanches as these fluffy cloud things that you pass out and you go away, which can be scary in its own. But there is a certain like primal, ugly, traumatic thing involved with these rescues that, I mean, even the rescuers deal with for forever, right? So, anyway, that happened in 2007. In 2010, we had another fatality, same location. A father, a local rider, snowboard rider at Snowbasin, weaving in and out of the boundary. And, one of the things that we deal with patrollers at Snowbasin is that our boundary is right on the ridge. And literally 10 feet away from the boundary sign is the start zone, right, where you can be caught, trapped, and killed. But it's 10 feet away from perfectly safe terrain that we work really hard to open. But, that stuff gets tracked out really quick. And then so what do you look for? And you look for the untracked stuff, right? So anyway, this guy goes down and takes about a 2,000 vertical foot ride. Not a big, crown. Like we talk about avalanches and we talk about crown size and like how destructive they may be. But really the point of this avalanche is that it really wasn't even enough to bury the person completely. But one of the big problems with avalanches is that quite often it's not the snow that kills you. It's the things that you hit while you're in the snow that kills you. And, he was found by some snowboarders, half buried, half not. And, that was another traumatic experience for certain patrollers that had to deal with that stuff. Because obviously we have a certain amount of responsibility, and we take this responsibility upon ourselves to try to make sure stuff is safe, right? Like terrain is safe to ski or ride or whatever else. And we know that just like right over there, there's like a death trap, and somebody's going to go there, and you feel like you could maybe do something to alleviate that by talking to people, educating people, and whatever not, but you really can't. So anyway, that's kind of like the next accident I wanted to mention, and then the last one I wanted to mention was a young man that went out to Hell's Canyon again with a friend of his, and I think they realized quickly like they were in over their head. Some places, when we talk about terrain management, I think in Corey's last lecture, and sometimes it's easy to avoid the terrain. Like you look at something and you think, well, that's easily avalanche terrain. But where the problem arises sometimes is that you can't really see the avalanche terrain until you're already in it. You've kind of rolled off the edge of this slope that looks perfectly fine, and all of a sudden you find yourself in some very serious avalanche terrain with no way out except for maybe hiking back up the way you came, which may not be safe either, right? Well, these guys kind of wound up in that situation, right? So they went out, found themselves in some avalanche terrain, tried to make it back to more mellow terrain in the boundary, and in the process, a young man got swept away. A patroller was near the boundary and saw the whole thing and activated our response, right at the moment. But still, I think people also have to realize that there are a lot of things that go into a rescue, and really in dealing with a rescue outside a ski area boundary, we talk about having your partner rescue, your beacons, your shovels, your probes, and your partner rescue. That really is your only chance at rescue, is that somebody that's right there with you to help you get out of that accident. Because when we have to organize our response, we have a lot of things we have to do. We have to clear the whole area and make sure nobody else is in there. We have to maybe deliver explosives to alleviate the danger to us before we go down there. We have to get people put in position. We have to close things, yada, yada, yada. It takes a long time. And in this scenario, we had absolutely zero amount of time with our response because we knew it had happened. And it still took us, and we did everything perfectly, your ideal situation in response. And we were starting our search at probably maybe 15, 20 minutes in, and didn't necessarily have a recovery until 40 minutes into the scenario. So involved in personally, and with that, like I said, we try to do everything as fast as we can to try to get a live recovery. In the process of recovering that victim, it's easy to know when they're dead by trauma for the most part, and that was one that stuck with me. Is observing the trauma. I think there was a lot of mental. It's not easy. I imagine there are people in this room that are big game hunters or whatever else, but when you're dealing with, a body or, something like that, it's not easy. And it's not easy to extricate, a victim from avalanche debris. There are certain things within that process that I'll never forget, certain smells, certain sights, certain things. But anyway, moving on from those, so those are kind of the more recent history of fatality accidents that we've had near and around our local mountain Snowbasin. So with that, I'm going to try to move on more to my own personal experience, which was shortly after that. So that happened in the spring of 2015. Fast forward to the fall and the winter of 2015. Trying to get the mountain open, and we had some good snow. I was working diligently on trying to get John Paul open and ready for public, and we made it. We got it open, a week before Christmas, maybe even a week and a half before Christmas, and that's a good sign to get John Paul open before Christmas, right? And we were all psyched about that, and then. Right around the 20th of December, we had a pretty intense storm cycle. We got like 20 or 30 inches. We tried to ski it up during that storm cycle and whatnot, but, anytime more touchy times of that snow is in the early phases of the snowpack, right? So the early months that the snow falls, gathers on the ground, is infected by temperatures and whatever, it still hasn't really got to a very stable place. So it was an early snowpack, and we got this, big storm to dump like 30 inches. Going into the avalanche reduction morning, everybody, was talking about it. Man, we're in super high danger. We need to be super careful. I was on the JP2 route, which really much just follows the north shaded slope of the JP terrain that you mostly get to see when you ride the lift. And it looks pretty benign, right? It's like, there's no big avalanche paths in here, but it's killed people in the past. It killed Dr. Ellison and Dean back in the 40s. There's been a number of other close calls and accidents in there. And but I was on a team with 2 other people, and I had plenty of explosives. So I felt pretty good about it. I'd been patrolling for like 15 years now, and thought I was pretty safe. So. In the process of trying to reduce the avalanche hazard, we threw a couple of charges, and there's a little prominent knob where they actually used to have an avalancher back in the day called Ranger's Roost. And it's really not an avalanche path for the most part, but it catches a lot of south wind, and it was kind of loaded. And, in the process of throwing the explosives, I wanted to get one kind of down deep off this edge, and then kind of hike up a little bit and then continue the route. Because once again, I knew that I had to do a lot of work before 9 o'clock. And I knew that at 9 o'clock people were going to be in the line, and they'd been waiting there for an hour, and they wanted to ski the powder. So I wanted to be really efficient. So instead of taking 2 laps and doing like these 2 shots on 2 different laps, I wanted to try to get one that was close to my lap in, so I didn't have to do it the next time. So I kind of stepped down the knob a little bit and called to my partners to make sure they were in a safe location. They called back, said they were good. I threw my charge. I started sidestepping up, and I saw that they had already traveled across the slope. And I'm like, well, okay. They went across that slope, and they were pretty close to the top of the slope. So in my mind, I wasn't really concerned about anything. But then I started to follow their track. And I'm like, well, I shouldn't wait here. I should wait with them. And so I started crossing the slope over to meet up with them. And halfway across, I hear this explosion. And sorry, that's getting some feedback, I think. But anyway, I hear this loud explosion, and it seemed odd to me for a minute because I'm like, that sounded really close, and I don't think that was the next route over. They must have put out a really big, you know, a 4-pounder, you know, on a stick somewhere, which sounds a lot louder. And all this is happening in like microseconds, right? So I hear this big explosion, and I thought, oh, that's odd. And then for a minute, like it was really dark that day. It was, you know, the winter solstice, close to the winter solstice. It was super dark. And I kind of felt this rumbling, and I heard this kind of rumbling, and I thought, there's an earthquake going on. Like, holy cow, there is an earthquake, literally an earthquake. And then, because normally, you know, ski patrollers, when they're doing avalanche reduction, they do ski cuts a lot, which actually triggers the avalanche at your skis. And that feels a lot different because you actually fall down to the ground, you feel your skis on the bed surface, you can kind of like edge in and let the snow wash around your feet for a little bit, and you're okay. But I didn't fall through the snow. I was still standing on the snow, but yet I was moving. And it took me a little while to realize, oh my gosh, like then I started seeing the blocks, and I saw the cracks and the stuff in the snow, which one of my route partners described as like, you know, refrigerator or small car sized chunks. And, you know, people will say, well, you can just, you know, point your skis and ski out of it, right? Well, I did. I looked for some trees that I could maybe ski over to and then grab onto. But when you're standing on something that's already moving, well, you can't like ski and turn off of it. You know, you would have to step and walk because you're already on something moving. Your skis aren't sliding across snow to give you directional control. So I remember like pointing my skis toward these trees and then just still going sideways, thinking like, why am I going for those trees? And then it just turned into what I can only describe as feeling like I was going down severe rapids in a river, you know, like a waterfall, because I could see, you know, the snow splashing up, you know, against the trees and just tumbling around me. And then, you know, I'd pulled my airbag, so it was funny because right as I'm standing on this block that starts to move, I kind of like lock eyes with my route partners across the way, and, you know, Peter Francis, those of you know, I'm just like, pull your cord, man. And you know, I had an airbag on, and my hand was already there, so, you know, I pulled it, you know, I heard the airbags inflate, whatever. It was kind of like, well, let's see if this thing works. And, you know, then I'm in this river, you know, falling down the rocks, and it just seems like the airbag was, well, when you're in an avalanche and moving snow, one thing you need to know is the fact that things that are lower in the snow surface go slower than what's on top. Like it has this tumbling effect. So that's why a lot of times people will say that you want your poles to release, you want your skis to release, is because when they're down in the snow, they are moving slower and they kind of drag you down as the snow comes over the top. So I was kind of like fighting this urge to get, and I was on, you know, telemark gear that doesn't really come off that easy. It's supposed to, but it didn't. And it was kind of like pulling my legs down and behind me, and the whole motion just wanted to like put my head downhill. And I knew, I mean, instinctively from everything else, that I didn't want my head to be downhill. I wanted my feet to be downhill. So I was fighting this urge to try to get myself back up, you know, in my head in a safe spot. And then I felt it, man. It was just like the most intense impact that I've ever felt before. But, you know, the stars, you know, you kind of go unconscious for a little bit, and just this sensation of like gotten hit by a car in my chest. So, and then it, you know, obviously microseconds again, right? Like microseconds, my brain starts processing the fact of, oh, I just hit a tree. And for a minute, I had the sensation of like, well, I've had a good one. I really can't complain too much. I've had a good life. It's it. It's good. I can call it good and be happy with it. I can make peace with whatever it is that's out there. I'm okay with that. And, you know, I mean, I still think I'd feel that way for the most part, but I actually have 2 little girls. Give me just a second. But I have 2 little girls, and I don't know how many people have kids or whatever, but it's different. Like I was totally okay with my life being gone and whatever, you know. But I just had this image of, I don't know, like it's hard to explain, right? Like your brain's processing all this stuff and whatever, but I would have to say that in this fraction of a second that I was able, in my mind, to experience their sadness and their pain for me being gone. And that I wasn't okay with. Like I said, like I was okay with me being done, but I wasn't okay with that affecting their life. And, you know, meanwhile, like I'm slammed against this tree, right? And what I can describe is basically like I felt like I was on the front plow of a snow plow that had just plowed into something and it was just spinning its wheels, trying to crush me into pieces. And so when I kind of had this thought, like, this is not okay, I remember, like, this deep, utter, like, primal yell that I did in the snow. And I remember the sound of it through the muffled snow, like, you know, somebody had a pillow over my face. But as I let out that scream and that yell, all of a sudden, I felt myself slide off of this tree, right? And so, you know, that was a big relief for me. Like, oh, I slid off the tree. And then I kind of, you know, I don't know if that was just like all the, you know, debris going past the airbag, you know, pulling me off or whatever, or, you know, if I made some like heave or movement in my body to change whatever. But the dynamics of, you know, me being pinned against that tree changed. And I dribbled down the debris, you know, in the snow, in this, you know, darkness of whatever, and finally came to rest. And, you know, and that was like, okay, I'm there. And, you know, do the airbags, whatever. I did have kind of like one arm kind of up a little bit, and I was able to kind of like brush away in my face and actually get to my radio. And, you know, I radioed, hey, man, I need medical now, you know, because at that point, I could feel my chest was definitely impacted, and I could start to taste the taste of blood, you know, coming up from my lungs and whatever. And, but, you know, I made the radio call. I knew there was a lit explosive still out there, which isn't necessarily like helping. But at the moment, it was kind of like, well, you know, that's kind of the least of my worries right now. But anyway, and then so my other partners, step two there, they kind of had the thing like, we know that that's a 90-second fuse. A lot has happened since then, and we haven't heard anything. So there was still a lit explosive out there. One of my partners said, you know, screw that, I'm going anyway. And I came down to make sure I was okay. You know, we heard it go off. It was a ways away. You know, and then I'm kind of in this situation where I just had this experience last spring of trying to yank this corpse out of the snow that had massive trauma to his chest. And that wasn't a great thought either, is like, you know what, now all my ski patrol friends and family, they're gonna have to dig me out of this hole, and they're gonna have to yank on my body, they're gonna have to dig my feet out, they're gonna have to load my carcass into a toboggan, they're gonna have to ski it down. That really sucked as imagery as well, right? And then I, you know, like I said, I was coughing up a lot of blood. I knew there was damage to my chest. I'd been on, you know, accidents where people have, you know, died, and, you know, I've seen people cough up blood and basically die, you know, from that experience. And so I kind of thought too, I'm like, well, you know, I got about 15 minutes, and my only real hope is to have, you know, somebody somewhere like be able to pump air into my lungs or whatever else, take me, you know, to an ambulance. So, you know, we kind of had to wait for a toboggan to get brought back up, and, in any case, it worked out good for me, right? So I'm still here, right? Patrollers like just moved into overdrive, and the lift mechanics like put the lift to just like super speed, got some people up, they got to me, and they hauled me down to the base, they threw me in an ambulance, and remember the ambulance driver was a friend of mine that I'd known from fire jobs, and actually it was snowing so hard that the ambulance almost crashed as we're going down Trappers Loop, and then I was like, well, it'd be nice for this day to get over, but I show up at the hospital, and they don't necessarily know the extent of internal injuries, and I'm laying there on the table, I'm freezing, I'm shivering, and they're like, oh yeah, he's got some broken ribs, yada yada yada, and then I threw up this big ball of blood that I'd just kind of been just ingesting back down, and they're like, oh, we better put him in the MRI machine. So they did that, and they realized that I had severe laceration to my liver and my kidneys and some internal injuries that if they didn't do drastic measures, I was going to die. So then I got to spend a week in the ICU, basically urinating out most of my kidney, which was a really terrible experience. The bruised lung is the ribs. It was a rough couple weeks from recovery, anyways, from that. But hey, I'm here, right? So anyway, kind of going back to where we started, right? So avalanche accidents, avalanche trauma. The key point of this lecture tonight is to help people understand that just because I buy the avalanche gear, I have a shovel, I have a probe, I have a beacon, I can go out with my friends, we can ski some sick POW. If I get caught in an avalanche, I'll just have this fluffy ride, they'll come dig me out. I trust Corey, I trust whoever, they'll dig me out, I'll be fine. Well, that's not the case, right? Because, all these incidents that I've been on in the local mountains, people have died of trauma, not necessarily asphyxiation. So I think driving home that point to people is important, because just because you have the gear, just because you have a little bit of knowledge about what kind of terrain there is out there, realize that, if it's moderate hazard out there in the avalanche world, you read the forecast, oh yeah, I feel really good about the snowpack. But in your travels, you end up traveling, in a place where even if, a 2-inch or 4-inch avalanche happens, it might not bury you. All it has to do is take you off your feet and send you down the gauntlet of rocks and trees, right? So that's kind of the point I'm trying to get at with that. But I'm also want to talk a little bit tonight about, like, well, why do we make those decisions, right? So all these accidents had at some point the choice of an individual to do something different, right? Like, I could have just done this way. Like for myself, I could have just taken a couple steps more up the hill, or I could have thrown the explosive that was in my pocket. It was right there. It wasn't even in my pack. I could have lit and thrown an explosive and been okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the human factors, which, if you're into that kind of lingo, is basically, why does a person that has all the knowledge and the skills and the know-how to avoid avalanches, why do they get into avalanches, right? Well, we're not all perfect, right? We all make bad decisions, and there are some things out there that influence us to make bad decisions when we're out skiing and enjoying the outdoors. And, people with big brains and way more motivation to study things than I do have put together all this information for us, right? So if you're familiar with Ian McCammon, he's done a lot of this, right? He's worked for the UAC for a long time, in avalanche forecasting for a long time, and he's, played with this same decision, like why, or this same problem. Why do so many people make poor decisions that actually cause accidents? And he's kind of put together a little, I don't know what you call it, acronym or whatever, that's called facets. And it basically describes some of these human traps that we cause for ourselves, right? So, and, obviously the, facets is to help us remember it, but it's really more than that, right? So the first one is familiarity. So doing things over and over again in terrain and whatever else that we're used to, right? Like, oh, every powder day that I've ever had it, wherever, I go out and I ski this shot, and it's always good, I always have a great experience, right? That's familiarity. That may be different this next time, right? Like, just because it's one way one time doesn't mean it's gonna be the same the next. So that's one of these human problems that we can run into, where we make bad decisions, right? So That's one of them. That's the F. The A, is acceptance. And with that, I think it's this new one, right? So acceptance is more of this human factor where we do things because we feel we'll be accepted by it, right? Like, oh, hey, if I ski this sick line, like, people are going to think I'm super awesome and whatever else. And all these other people are skiing this stuff, and I want to be as cool as they are. I want to be accepted. And where I think that's really maybe exploited in our day and age, right, is that what are people, it boggles my mind because I'm not of this generation, but there are plenty of people out there, and for whatever, I'm not judging anything. Like, they get a lot of self-worth back from showing the cool things they did, via Instagram or Facebook or whatever else. And I'm okay with that. Like, that's just how life is these days. But people are going to make some seriously poor decisions because they want to get that sick powder shot of them skiing some powder or the line that they did and whatever else. So there's a lot of that plays into it nowadays of like, oh, check out my Instagram photo, sick pow, and when where you need to go to get sick pow, well, probably some avalanche terrain. So there's acceptance is also will drive us to do things that we normally wouldn't think of doing, right? We think would be poor choices, right? So the C in facets is consistency, and this is the one that I have a problem with, right? Because consistency, even though I guess the words he used, he had to creatively use words for something we could remember, right? Consistency describes more of people that do things because, by golly, that's what I set out to do today. I'm going to do it today. I spent 2 weeks planning out this trip to go with my friends and go skin up and wherever, and we got all this snow, and I'm going to do it. Like, I'm going to get my ass up at 4:30 in the morning. We're going to drive up to this trailhead. We're going to skin up this line, and we're going to ski this shot. Because that's just the plan. I have a hard time with that. That was a big contributing factor in my accident. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that can see people that won't give up on what they're supposed to do, even if it stops making sense, right? So that's the C in facets, right? Think about it. So the E is called expert halo. And so what that refers to is that a lot of times when we don't have enough experience base to make our own decisions, we rely on others, right? And if somebody appears to be an expert, they got all the gear, they got all the right stories, they got all the whatever else, that we sometimes think that what they think is applicable, and they might not be the expert, or they might be wrong, or whatever else, but we rely on somebody else's expert halo for the decisions we make. Like, oh, my friend, Johnny, he says that skiing this line in hills is always good and it's never bad, or whatever else. That type of thing, we can fall into that, right? And so moving on to the T in facets, stands for tracks. And really that describes this phenomenon called scarcity. And this one, I think, is super viable, especially in years like this year, right? So scarcity refers to kind of like first tracks, and getting there and skiing the powder before other people. Like, there's not enough powder to go around. Like, I think it's a good guess to say that on years where there's not a good lot of skiing out there, that there's more accidents than there is when there's not. And, earlier in the season, whatever else. But basically, if you had a really good powder year, you get to the top of a slope that looks just super awesome, but dangerous. If you've had plenty of powder turns that year, where it's easy for you to say no, right? Like, I'll pass on this one, I'm full. But in the years where you haven't had that satiation of your powder urge, you might make those poor choices because it's scarcity. Or if you know somebody's on the skin track behind you, and you know who that is. I mean, there's a lot of that around here. I know in the side country of Snowbasin, boy, there's been almost fistfights about who's going to get the first line down this shot, and it turns into that, right? And then that might force you to make a bad decision, right? So then the last one, the social aspect of it, the S in facets, and that talks about whether it's deemed socially acceptable to do this or that, or if you're in this big group, right? If you're in a group of friends, and sometimes we do things just to impress the group a little bit, or we might not. We might just decide to be the follower in that group or whatever else. But like I said, these are just a few of the many human characteristic flaws that we have that can make us make a bad decision or lead us to make bad decisions that we normally wouldn't work all the time. Myself, if I'm hungry and tired, I'm making bad choices all the time, especially, and things I know that I should do around the house or say to the wife, like, the kids, whatever, it just goes right out the window if I'm hungry and tired. But if you're at the end of a tour, right, and you're hungry and you're tired and you're cold, and the shortest route to your car is through avalanche terrain, well, you're probably more apt to ski that avalanche terrain than you are to go out and around, right? So, but I think the important thing is for you to know yourself. And if you know through experience in life that when you get in a situation, you have the propensity to make bad choices, well, then you can set some type of alarm to try to keep you from doing that, right? Like, it's been described before as if you know that your gun shoots right, well, you want to aim left, It's that type of mentality. If you know that you happen to be a hard charger or a consistent person and maybe a little bit aggressive, a good choice for a route partner is somebody that has the ability, a safer person that's able to tell you, at the last moment, like, hey man, I don't feel good about that. So that plays into, setting up yourself for success and avoiding some of those. Another idea to avoid some of these traps is, and I heard it at a USAW conference. I can't remember the gal's name, but it really made sense to me that, like, at the end of your tour, right when you get to that moment where you can decide to either take this path, which is maybe a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more avalanche terrain, or this safer path, take a moment, clear your head, maybe just take a break. I'm into meditation these days, maybe clear your mind for a little bit and then think about it again. Those are all things that I hope can help and I think that could. But anyway, like I'm really sorry for being so emotional or whatever. But I appreciate you all for listening to me say what I have to say because number one, sometimes the ski patrollers get labeled as, the snow cops or the powder police or whatever else. It's really not the case. Like, because, we keep certain terrain open or closed and all the things we do, it really goes into the fact that, like, hey, the last thing we want to do is go dig a frozen body out of the ground. Last thing we want to do is go, like, do that. We want, believe me, we want the people that pay to come to the resort or whatever else to ski as much powder as they possibly can safely. We want that every time. We get plenty of powder before you guys even get to the left. So we're not saving it for ourselves after 9 o'clock. So anyway, it means a lot to us as patrollers to have people come up and say, like, hey, thanks for the hard work or whatever else. And, it's rough when we have to slow speeders down and we get, the bad names. We can deal with that for the most part, but it really means a lot for us, for you all to, say, hey, thanks for what you're doing. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say here that, managing side country that's accessible by a ski resort has about 1 million problems with it, right? It's not black and white. It's not simple. If you guys want to talk to me about it afterwards, I'd be happy anytime to try to help you explain why we do what we do with our sign lines and our gates and et cetera. And maybe it'll make sense to you, maybe it won't. But it's super complex. I wish it was simpler. I don't have any easy answers for you. But what I can tell you is, even though it's complex, please ask before. Don't just say, like, well, this doesn't make sense. This is stupid. I'm just going to duck this rope and go in here. Please talk to the ski patrol. Sometimes, maybe we seem arrogant or busy or whatever else, like we don't want to talk to you. But if it's going to keep you safe and it's going to help you understand the process, man, we would love to try to explain our point of view to how it's ran that way and why it's ran that way. Wow, I didn't think I was going to be able to talk for like 20 minutes, but apparently I can. So anyway, if you have any questions, talk to me afterwards, or I'll answer some right now. Of course, he's got time, but I don't know. Sounds pretty good.
It's got Michelle C. saying you rock my booth.
Michelle, oh, okay, all right, yeah. There's probably another ski patroller who likes me. And is hoping that I will take them and show them secret powder stashes. So.
Hey, girl.
All right, well, if you guys don't have any questions, like maybe we can cut the camera off and I can actually answer some questions where I won't get in trouble with the ski resort. All right, thanks. We good?